Hey everybody, Ryan here. Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios. Today, I am testing the bold claims of up-and-coming amplifier plugin developer Otto with their first venture into what they call boutique high-gain amplifier tones with the 1111. I caught wind of this product's existence approximately 6 months ago, and I believe it even came from one of my YouTube comments, so thank you for that. Within a couple of months, though, it went on sale over the holidays, and it's like, what the hell? You know, it's got a 14-day free trial, there's a little bit of buzz about this, if I like it, it's only 50 to 60 bucks, big deal. And I was pleasantly surprised. It brings a lot of things to the table that I think a lot of contemporary amplifier tones and VST tones are lacking, or at least gloss over when it comes to some of my favorite guitar sounds over the past 40 years. And because of that, I've kind of put it as one of my Plague Scythe Studios staples in terms of the curated VST plugin list that I've tried to organize for, a lot of my projects going forward. I was that impressed by it. However, over the past few months, some of you might remember that kind of explained how burnout I am on looking at amplifier plugins. The seemingly never-ending TikTok release cycle of some of these brands, and it's not exclusive to just the one that I've talked about, has taken a little bit of wind out of my sails when it comes to exploring a lot of these new VST amp plugins, because with a lot of it, they're just treading the same old ground over and over, or they're slapping an artist's name on something that you very well could have achieved those tones with different plugins combined. But beyond that even, I'm starting to realize I'm growing tired of certain products and brands that do one thing really well, but then kind of use as an excuse to sell you accessories on the side or things that I think other brands do better. For instance, like a Mesa Boogie amplifier. Well, don't put an Ibanez Tube Screamer over there. We have a Mesa Boogie Grid Slammer, which is a good pedal, but just an example of, well, you're known for this thing. Can you kind of stay in your lane or make something new instead of a Tube Screamer ripoff? Wearing a Fractal Audio shirt. They would probably be some of the best people in the world to make a full range flat response speaker and enclosure and power amplifier, or hell, maybe even a tube amplifier, but they stay in their lane because they focus on one thing and they admit, hey, this solution's great. Work with this brand, Matrix Power Amps, or what have you. I respect that a lot because it shows focus, and we are really proud of this one product. And even if you already have something that serves the same function, we bet that ours is better, and that alone is going to sell units. And that's one of the things that really attracted me to this amplifier sim. It is distortion only, high gain, not to say you can't do low gain and cleans, oddly enough, but there's no overdrive section. There is no reverb, delay, echo, EQ. You see what you see. Front, back of the amp, an amplifier, some cab IRs, and you can do with that what you will. I completely appreciate that in a sea of all-in-one suites and your Helix natives or your bias effects. There is a time and place for both, but I feel like for a lot of heavy metal players, especially those looking for dry rhythm tones, most of the time you're just going to kind of boost the input, change your EQ, and maybe use an echo effect a lot of the time for the genres that we play. And I very much feel like there is that self-awareness coming from Otto, which is appreciated. So with all that in mind, despite my positive first impressions of 1111, I was not planning to make a review video on it. Still working on a lot of Fractal Audio-centric content, have some hardware stuff that I hope to get to here in the next couple of months. not to mention waiting on a couple critical pieces of gear to finish an EP. Lots going on that can simply justify over making another plugin video. But Reed from Otto Audio ended up getting in contact with me personally, and we had some great email conversations revolving around high gain amplifier designs, the state of the market, how apparently this was built from the ground up over the course of the past several years, basically in a garage. He's kind of a one-man show, it sounds like, very much like what I do, very much like a lot of the brands and products that I try to show off on this channel, which earned a great deal of respect from me. And despite my ramblings on similar subjects in the recent past, he gave me the green light to make a video so I could share what I come up with you guys. Now, I say all that not to put a particular spin or bias on this video, but to state clearly that, yes, I have had direct contact with the developer, but no, this is not a sponsored video. This is not a paid review. There's no affiliate codes or anything like that. I have no incentive to say anything good or bad about this product. It's all about what I feel, and that's just the way I operate, because otherwise, to me, it's a conflict of interest. I don't mind direct advertising. Done that in the past with brands like Chariotone, because you know it's an ad. But this is merely the vessel for content creation, and you guys pay me by watching advertisements. So we're all even Stevens there. Not to go off on a tangent, but maybe some recent subscribers may not realize how I go about this. So I say all of that because, quite frankly, I'm going to have a lot of positive things to say about this, far more than negative, and all that's based on my experience, not a paycheck. But even with the negative things, I don't necessarily want this to change. I think it fills a lot of the holes that have been left behind by recent plugin releases. And if you're using some other amplifier plugins already, this could be a very great way to complement those sounds. Or if you're starting from scratch and you've not spent a penny on amplifier plugins, I think this is going to be your kind of 80 for 20 plugin, maybe 90 for 10, quite frankly. If you can get over some of the UI differences and look past some of the descriptions, if you don't know what they mean, that is, then you can get all sorts of amplifier tones in here. Now, I'm going to kind of breeze over some of these controls for the time being and exactly what they do. We'll dive into that here momentarily. But if you just start with the presets, there's this whole new amp match section. And I gotta say, they're pretty impressive. Despite this having what looks to be a fixed architecture, you're not gonna have a Mesa Mark Series 5-band graphic EQ on here, or a bunch of bright switches or clipping diodes, what have you. You can still get everything from a clean combo amplifier sound to a cranked 5150 stealth to an SLO kind of sound, and they're all very convincing. So to prove that, let's start by disabling the cabinet impulse response section, load up a third-party impulse response loader, and shoot this out with some comparable amplifier models with this dialed in to try to match them as closely as possible. All these, in my book, kind of cover my main tones, and in fact reflect a lot of the amplifiers that I have in real life. So if this can keep up with those sounds, I feel like, minus a few edge cases, which we're going to explore later, I think that's going to cover what most people will want out of anywhere from classic to contemporary heavy metal tones. Now, none of those two demonstrations sounded 100% like for like, and you should expect them to be, right? I mean, from different plugins, you could take two of the exact same amp model off the shelf. They're going to sound a little different just because of component tolerances and the like. But you can still hear a lot of those fundamental characteristics get translated in different modes on this amplifier, where like the chewy texture of the dual rectifier comes out, or a lot of that crackly, sizzly high end of a hot rodded Marshall circuit. Even if the overall EQ spectrum isn't 100% identical, even if the input EQ driving the preamplifier isn't 100% identical, you can still hear a lot of those distinct characteristics that I think stuff like more basic tone matches or even Kemper profiles outright miss a lot of the times. And I believe this is being achieved with this control. So this is what they're calling descending harmonics. I don't know what this is 100%. I don't know if we're looking at different preamplifier models altogether, or kind of the same preamplifier model with different components and values getting changed along the way. However, this is kind of where I think you should start. Even if you don't touch a single other control on this amplifier, this is where you're going to get most of your changes. Now, based on some of the naming schemes here, I can kind of imagine what they're shooting for, right? 1991, 1992, very much dual rec 5150 sounding. Black, probably Metallica's Black Album. There's zero sequence harmonics and stuff that makes me think there's probably some transistors, solid state elements going on in this circuit. Low Throne, especially, sounds very Boss HM2, which is exciting because, as I've kind of stated in the past, I think for a lot of contemporary tight metal tones, we kind of got it figured out. I mean, everyone likes their own little flavor of things. I kind of prefer to stick with the hot rodded Marshall and dual rectifier style of sounds. Some people prefer, 5150 and they die on that sword. But you take those kind of amplifier platforms, boost them with a tube screamer or something like a clean boost and chop off a lot of the low end. We've got that sound mostly figured out, right? What seems to be missing is integrating a lot of the sounds we hear over the past several decades that have a transistor or solid state based pedal boosting a tube amplifier. I've always thought, why can't we get all of that in one package? Why can't we flip some switches and start integrating stuff like hard clipping circuits before the main tube preamplifier? Why can't we have a soft clipping section somewhere or something that sounds similar without using an op amp? Why can't we have a lot of these pre-EQ controls? And I think that may be what's going on here because, like I said earlier, there's no pedal section, but a lot of this stuff sounds like it's being boosted by EQ profiles or certainly distortion textures that are reminiscent of some of those classic pedal tones, which I'm very much in favor of. So this right here is pretty much going to change the behavior of everything going forward throughout these controls. And that kind of goes for all of the more traditional amplifier controls. Like the depth and presence may not be very powerful or reactive sounding until you switch to a couple other modes, say over here on the back of the amplifier. The master volume control may not sound like it's doing a whole lot until you start pushing the bias on the back, or you really start playing off of the interaction with the preamp saturation. So you kind of have to start at a control and tweak as you go and see how they interact. For instance, the master volume in particular, for a lot of the stuff that I like, those clean power amp sounds, it's not going to sound like it's doing a whole lot, and you keep it low and preamp high, and it does what you expect. But for a lot of the nasty, really disgusting, like compressed, hitting the sweet spot sounds that a lot of contemporary music's going for, you will want this thing cranked in the noon to even 2, 3 o'clock region, depending on your controls on the rear. So keep that in mind. And that goes even more so for the preamplifier controls because, a lot of us have been conditioned to kind of expect on a high gain amplifier circuit, especially one that looks like this, to start over here and it's really anemic and kind of unusable. In fact, you can't even use it on zero because a lot of times there's just no signal. And then, around maybe noon for really high gain amplifiers, or more likely 1:30 to 2 o'clock is where you start to get into some appreciable amount of distortion. And even then, a lot of the times you have to boost it or use a pedal. And then, up here into the 10 region is just stupid and has no articulation and it's totally mush. Because that's just the limitations of real amplifier designs a lot of the times. Not really the case with this. In fact, for a lot of those extreme sounds, the things that you don't achieve until 2, 3 o'clock on a lot of amplifiers, you're going to find that back here at about 4 or 5. And then for some extremely saturated, modern, heavily compressed tones around here. This is just crazy. And then on minimum is completely clean, but usable. So I don't know if they're like interpolating between different circuits or what exactly is going on here, but the preamplifier control kind of behaves as one should, in my opinion, from an ideal standpoint. Now that covers the main amplifier controls, yet we are nowhere near finished with the front panel. This is where you can select the built-in cabinet impulse responses. They are labeled 1 through 22, and apparently they were done on purpose that way because you have to listen and make a judgment call based off of how they sound, not how they're named. And I'm just as guilty as anyone else of this because I know what a, close mic T75 sounds like. I know what a V30 and a Mesa cabinet sounds like with a different array of microphones. So I want to kind of start with those to judge amplifiers a lot of the times because that's what's, what I'm used to. And I know how to build amp sounds around that. But with this, you're kind of forced to go through and use this in conjunction with the harmonic selector over here, the submodel, to build your overall rig. And there's some of these, just like in this selection, that kind of have a honky old school death metal sound, which are really cool. Some of them are really full range and thick and contemporary, and there's a little bit of everything in between. So you can absolutely disable this from the back if you want to use your own IRs, because you cannot load your own in this at this time. That is one improvement I would like to see. But I think for a lot of people that want it all in one package, you're probably going to find most of what you need here, and using EQ before and after the amp is going to cover a lot of those holes. Another huge tone shaping feature that I hope starts to become standard going forward on a lot of amplifier plugins, because again, Fractal has been doing it for some time now, is the impedance curve selector. With the lower end being more bass and hi-fi focused, and then you start to get into some flatter and more mid-range focused sounds as you increase throughout the list. You put all of that in a blender and you have so many insane combinations that it can kind of make your head spin. And it certainly did that for me in the first couple of hours of tweaking, because I thought I would find like, okay, here's everything this thing can do. Wait a minute, I've not played with this in the past 30 minutes. Holy crap, like that changes everything. So for me, there is a kind of a range of both the cabs and the impedance curves that my ear naturally starts to, favor. But even then, if you find that you're missing something, or you think, well, I've exhausted this amp's possibilities, it's just not doing what I want, keep exploring, because that impedance curve selector is huge. In fact, it kind of plays with the mid response and a lot of even the power amps response to achieve things that you otherwise simply cannot. Finishing off on the rest of the bottom row here next to where we selected our descending harmonics submenu thing, you of course have an input and output, both ranging from -12 to 12 dB. For a lot of sounds I find on downtuned 6 strings or even 7 strings that don't need tightened up, you can absolutely slam the input and turn the preamplifier down a little bit to get a tighter high end. I'm sure there is some sort of bright cap or something equivalent going on in that circuit, because as you lower the preamplifier, raise the input, you do get a tighter, more grindy sound, as you might expect. So don't overlook that, even if your signal is hot enough as is. Output, of course, kind of standard. Mono, stereo, and stereo. This one's interesting. Stereo, of course, for stereo inputs. Mono, of course, for mono inputs. But the mono stereo option includes a built-in double tracker, which I've sampled some other free ones, some paid for ones recently, and this one is right up there with the best, in my opinion. It feels great to play through. It sounds great. I actually tested a recording in my car. It sounded great in there. Obviously not quite up to the same standard as a real double track signal, but for just testing sounds, especially through headphones, it does sound really great. So I'm going to be showing that feature off in a lot of the tones that I dialed in. Of course, there's the oversampling options, and then 2 controls that you will see on every one of these demos. They are engaged because they just sound worse when they're disengaged. Of course, there's the power amp, which you might find for some DI sounds, or if you're stacking amplifiers together, which you can do, wouldn't necessarily think you have to for a lot of stuff. Maybe you want that turned off, or for maybe like a bass tone, which, by the way, there are bass presets in here, and I'll show you an example of how good it can work on a bass guitar. And then the punch control just makes it more dynamic and bigger. I don't exactly know what's going on here, if this has to do with the impedance curve reactivity, or if there's some advanced output transformer algorithm at play here to manipulate the transients. I don't know. Either way, it just sounds better on, it sounds more realistic on, and especially with that control engaged in conjunction with some of the stuff we'll look at around back, it's probably the closest thing to a mic'd up amplifier in another room sound I've ever heard through these studio monitors. That's not to say that I haven't heard great results out of a lot of the stuff that we've explored in the past, and in isolation, the amplifier simulation alone is just like, it's exactly like the real amplifier on recording, but it still kind of sounds like you're playing through a recording based on the cabinet simulation and stuff like that, which is great. That's fine. That's how I'm judging a lot of these kind of things most of the time. But there is a rawness to this, an unpolished element that sounds like, wow, this really feels like, you know, some power hitting a microphone and compressing the, you know, the diaphragm, and it's hitting maybe a brick wall limiter, and it's hitting some transformer. Like, there's just something more visceral about the way that this reacts, especially with that punch control enabled. Now, if the front panel wasn't enough to give you amp tweakers and nerdgasm, flipping to the back just might. Over here, starting on the left, we have this very subtle output mod control, which I would bet, if I had to guess, has something to do with an output transformer. It's very subtle. The overall frequency response doesn't really change, but there's just a slight feel difference, maybe even some subtle dynamic range differences, as if one's like an underpower transformer, one's like a big boy, you know, SLO transformer. This is kind of one of the last things I touch on the presets that I made or tweaked, kind of like a better, worse, or is this more like what I'm going for? Or is this more like what I'm going for? So most of the time you'll see it in the purple position, sometimes in the orange, no big deal. Punish, almost always I have that engaged. This kind of sounds like switching between a 3-gain stage amplifier to a 4-gain stage amplifier, very akin to, you know, adding a hot mod to a Marshall Plexi circuit or a 2204, 2203 circuit like I did with my Cherry Tone Gargoyle. So you can expect a huge increase in gain and saturation with this control engaged even at the same pre-amplifier setting. The plus 10 dB is kind of like having a built-in boost up front, 10 decibels, you know, crank tube screamer, or you know, kind of like a Fort and Grind, Horizon, attack pedal, whatever. Of course, you can do that with the input down here as well, but obviously this is another way to achieve that. And of course, you could stack them for an insane amount of boost, which, as we'll get into, really not going to be necessary for a lot of the settings on here. The low control is interesting because it actually adds in low end, which can be useful for, you know, bass guitar applications. It can actually be useful for some of the more vintage death metal sounds, I find, because yes, filtering out the low end does result in a tighter sound, but you'll actually hear, you know, Pantera style guitars, a lot of early death metal, they still have some low end in there. It's enough to be chunky without, you know, necessarily getting into the crunch of palm mutes. So this is useful. Definitely can be great for, you know, some slower paced, lower tempo material. Power tube selection. Love it, love it, love it. The power tubes on hand is kind of what I would normally go for. You'll see I use KT88s a lot because they're hard to come by in real amplifiers because they're hard to make, they're expensive, and that obviously isn't going to change anytime soon with recent events. So if you're going after, you know, kind of a Marshall sound or a Mesa sound or what have you, then this is another one of those cherry on top controls to bring you that much closer. This group of 4 controls, however, very much falls in line with the impedance curve selector, where it's kind of a novelty and you're not going to see it on a vast majority of the competition. And if you do, I feel like they're a little more generic and aren't really living up to the overall usability of the controls that are implemented here. This is very on par with Fractal Audio level of sag and bias and feedback controls, which again, some stuff I usually wouldn't talk about because it's never there. So the overall power sag and the bias of the power tubes does have both tonal and feel impact, but I think on recording, this is kind of where I go to differentiate between a really tight and articulate or bouncy kind of transient heavy amplifier to something that is nastier and more compressed and just in your face a lot. So you'll see for some of the nicer, tighter tones, I will definitely cold bias the output tubes. And then for some of the, again, the nastier, more contemporary stuff, I'll bias them hot, which, there's no physical repercussions in a plugin, so you can do that. And at times even turn up the sag to extreme values to just give it that much more of a strained character that can really work for those kind of genres. Feedback does sound like it's a negative feedback control and will lessen the impact of stuff like the impedance curve, the presence, the depth controls, and to a lesser extent, maybe the resonance of the cabinets, that we'll get into that here in a moment. So again, for like rectifier tones that at least on the modern mode, don't have negative feedback, turn those all the way down. You get it really nasty. Or for more 5150, Soldano, or Mesa Mark series tones, then you'll want to crank this up fairly high. Snarl, I can't 100% tell where this is happening in the signal path. Either way, to get a lot of those contemporary, more nice sounding metal tones, I do keep this on the higher end. And then by the time, for some of the more aggressive sounds, you push a lot of the mids and the thing sounds angry enough already, then you probably want to cut this back, because otherwise you're going to end up with an angry jar of wasps kind of tone. So another powerful one. Amplitude, as far as I can tell, is just another post power amp control. This is like your master for the channel. This is your master for the power amp. And then of course you have your overall output volume. So you'll be able to find something that works by balancing all of those. And finally, over here is once again where you can change your cabinet selection like you can on the front, but you also have this included resonance control, which very much sounds like it's doing the, low end bump and then the gradual rise based off of the speaker feedback. I've tended to use this as sort of my finishing touch after selecting the impedance curve. A lot of that is very difficult to digest. It's a lot to swallow. And I think the best thing we can do right now is just listen to the insane variety of tones that you can get out of the single platform. There's not a whole lot more I can say about 1111 that you would not have already picked up on throughout the demonstrations in this video. But if I had to summarize a few of the key takeaways that maybe didn't get translated as well, one of them would be that the overall sound and gain structure of this amplifier is much colder and maybe could be defined as solid state sounding to some people's ears. Not to say that this doesn't sound like a tube amplifier on most of the settings that you just heard, but there is an element of mid-range saturated tube crunch that you might have picked up on some of the competing plugins that we showed earlier on, that even at similar settings doesn't sound like it's quite as much there here. And maybe it's something as simple as the EQ filtering going into the amplifier. But I would equate this to kind of like a stacked metal zone in front of a dual rec, you know, like the early Cannibal Corpse tone, or it even kind of reminds me of the gain structure of something like my Digitech Metal Master, or some of my old distortion pedals growing up. And that's not to say it's a bad thing. We have everything else, right? All that other stuff is already being covered. And I've been saying for years at this point, I want more of that nasty, cold, you know, just gritty, weird side of heavy metal guitar represented here. And I think this does a really good job. In fact, I think there are so many modern guitar players and producers nowadays that end up buying a lot of those more traditionally voiced and designed guitar amplifiers and even plugins that would be more home on this platform, because they'll grab this kind of stuff and rant and rave about, oh, how realistic this sounds. It's like, wow, you can plug straight in and it just sounds just like a plexi or just like a dual rectifier. Then they'll spend the next hour adding totally unrealistic cab impulse responses, 10,000 EQ moves before and after to totally shred the DI, and then mixing in different distortion pedals or soft clipping pedals, and then you end up with a product. It's like, well, now it doesn't even sound like that amp anymore. So what was the point in starting with something that is so realistic or represents this circuit when you're just gonna butcher it? Not to say that it sounds bad, but that you could have just simplified your workflow and started with something that maybe out of the box doesn't sound the way you think an amplifier should, but it actually gets you to a better result more quickly. And I think that's where 1111 really fits in. I'm not gonna go for this thing when I want my, you know, perfectly represented dual rectifier sound, but it does a dual rec sound really great. I'm not going to go to this thing if I want a mid-range Marshall crunch or, you know, like a classic rat through a JCM 800. That's not going to be my first pick. However, for a more contemporary approach to guitar distortion design, this would be one of my first picks as a blank slate. Whether you want to go after that Mick Gordon chainsaw style sound from the Doom OST, or, you know, like an At the Gates HM2 boosted metal zone kind of flavor, it's very much here. And I think this is smoking the competition on representing that side of heavy metal guitar playing. And even some doom and stonery and sludgy sounding stuff. Even when one of these amplifier matches, you can see, you know, like Sun amplifiers represented, as I showed. So I very much think that Otto Audio is in tune with a big portion of the heavy metal playing audience that just doesn't get represented a lot of the times. A lot of the market and the hype is focused on, you know, this very particular prog inspired and focused type of heavy metal, whereas I think there's more to that. Otherwise, there wouldn't be such a huge market when it comes to new fuzz pedals or reissues of HM2 style circuits. So I'm glad that someone has listened to that demand, especially in the digital space, and try to work around that without just cloning something. It's a different approach to getting the overall same sound. And that's what I've always been about. I want to strip stuff down to its bare metal and glass and see, you know, how can we achieve that kind of sound that I mentioned earlier, a rat through a JCM 800. Wouldn't it be great if you could just get rid of a lot of the junk in that circuit and just make it one solid thing? And I think this is inching closer to that philosophy, which makes me excited. So definitely keep an eye out on Otto Audio. Like I said earlier, this isn't going to replace every plugin in my arsenal. I'm not going to constrain myself to playing through one platform, whether that be a pedal or an amplifier or a guitar, especially a plugin. But damn if this doesn't complement it extremely well. And this will definitely be one of my first go-tos when it comes to contemporary amplifier distortion. So hats off to Otto Audio. Very much look forward to the Cabs Volume 1 and checking those out, pairing those with the other gear I have, and best wishes going forward. Please stay on the righteous path. Do not look into the darkness like some of the other brands out there. I'm rooting for you. So with that, thank you so very much for watching. As always, any other questions and comments, leave them down below, and I'll try to get back to you. Thank you. Bye.